Hey guys, welcome back to another painting tutorial. Today, as you can see, I'm going to be painting an Eldar Windrider Jetbike in the Biel Tan colour scheme. Before I go ahead with this, I just want to say thanks to everyone who's left likes and comments on my videos. As I'm still fairly new to this whole YouTubing thing, it's really good to know that people are watching my videos and are liking what I'm putting out. So yeah, if you do like any of this stuff, then please leave me a like. I do read all your comments, and yeah, thanks a lot, guys. I know the painting tutorials haven't got as many views as some of the bat reps I've put out, but I know a few guys have come up to me in the club and said how much they've liked them, so I'm planning to keep putting these out, and yeah, hopefully there's people out there finding them useful. So, for the Eldar Jetbike, first thing I want to paint is the rider. Now, on my Jetbike models, I've left the rider as a separate part to the rest of the model, because he's going to be painted, obviously as you can see here, in mostly white, whereas most of the bike itself is green, and it just helps to separate the two, and the rider can be glued back on at the end really easy. So here we've got our Jetbike rider. Now I've undercoated him in Games Workshop's Skull White Spray. I think they may have changed the name of it now, but it's the same stuff. And I'm going to start by painting him in Ulthuan Grey, the Citadel layer paint. This is a really good starting colour for a lot of different sort of white armours, not just on things like Eldar Guardians, but it can work really well for things like White Scar Space Marines, pre-Heresy World Eaters, that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and paint in white. Okay, so I've base painted this guy with Ulthuan Grey now, and at this stage it's not overly important to be really neat, because the few bits that aren't going to be grey are going to get more paint on the green parts eventually, and also we're going to do a wash over this anyway, so even if the coverage isn't 100%, it's okay because we've got a wash and a layer paint to come. Now, when you're painting white, you need to sort of bear in mind that very few things are really truly white. They simply look white because they're very close to white. So a colour like this White Scar, which is pure white, should only really be used for like the top layer or the edge highlight on white things, and actually most white is really just light shades of grey. So to start with getting some depth into this model, we're going to give him a wash with Games Workshop Null Oil. Now this may seem a little bit counterintuitive to paint a white model with really dark black shade, but what this is going to do is add depth so we can then build it back up and give him a really crisp finish. On the actual finished model you'll see very little of this Null Oil, and even where you do see it, the aim here isn't to apply a really thick coat, it's just a sort of a thin layer of it, so it won't really look black, it'll just look grey in the recesses, which is exactly how white that's in shadow looks. It looks grey. So I'm going to paint that over the whole model. Apart from the top of the head, you don't really need to worry about that, because that's going to be green, and that's a good bit to hold the model by while you're doing this, and then leave him to dry. A tip when working with these Guardian Jetbike riders who don't have bases is when they're drying, particularly if it's an all-over coat, to sort of have them in this sitting position, like I've got this guy with their back or the top of their head leaning against something. That way there's a lot less of the model that's in contact with the table, so it's less likely to either stick to it or just get smudged. Some people might want to sort of mount this guy on top of an old paint pot, just blue tack his feet onto the top. That works just as well, but I find this method works fine. But anyway, I'll be back once the ink wash has dried. So there we go, the Null Oil has added some shade and some depth to this model. As you can see, I've not really worried about the head, because that's going to be green anyway, but the faceplate you need to use this bit on as well, because that's going to be white. Next stage is going to be to start building up the layering on the armour, and most of that is going to be using Ulthuan Grey again, the colour we originally base coated it in. And the idea here is going to be to paint that on all the armour panels and also on the more raised parts of the undersuit, so that isn't looking quite so grey. And this will start to look really white next to the much darker grey. Even though Ulthuan grey isn't true white, it'll look white enough for the purposes of looking good on the table. Once I've highlighted that, then I'm going to do an edge highlight using skull white, but that's probably going to be the last stage on the model, because what I'm going to want to do after I've painted the layer of Ulthuan grey is to work on the green parts of the model and the eye lenses. I always like to leave the final highlight to last, so that anything else I do doesn't mess up the final highlight if I go wrong with it. So, going to do the Ulthuan grey layer, and then I'll be back. Okay, so unsurprisingly I had to use 2 layers to do that, and it's always better to use 2 thin layers than 1 thick layer, and I needed to do that to get the right coverage. But here you can see now the parts of the model that are raised up are this sort of nice almost white tone, and everything in sort of the recesses is shades of grey, which helps to shade the model down. Now before I do the highlight on the armour, I'm going to block out the other colours on the model. So for the eyes and the little spirit stone in the chest, I'm going to use corn red to base coat those. And then for the shoulder pads and the majority of the helmet, but not the faceplate, which I'm leaving white, I'm going to be using warpstone glow to do them in green. So going to block those colours out and be back to show you what's next. Okay, so the next bit is going to be to get the nice glowing effect on the gem and also the eye lenses. Now, normally a lot of painting guides will show you to do this at the end. I personally prefer to do it about halfway through, because if you sort of go over, particularly with the eye lenses, onto the rest of the face, you can go back and neaten it up now rather than once there's a lot more highlights on the face, which can make it a little more fiddly, just the way I like to do it. And for these I'm going to use a technique that I've used a couple of times before, so if you've seen my Dark Reapers video you'll probably be familiar with this. So for the gem, what I do is after I've got the corn red base paint, as you can see on this little bit of card I've painted it out on, I then paint Evil Sun Scarlet over about 2/3 to 3/4 of the model, leaving one of the top corners in the darker colour. Once that's dry, I paint just a little line in the opposite corner of, I think it's fiery orange, I think that colour is. It's like an orange colour. And then a tiny dot of white in the corner that's been left dark. And when you apply that to the actual gem, it produces a really nice 3D look. For the eye lenses, it's a similar technique, which is why I'll tend to do it at the same time. And so you've got the whole eye lens, this is supposed to represent the eye, painted in corn red, and then you do about 2/3 of it in Evil Sun Scarlet, and then just the bottom corner in this fiery orange again. And that's all you really need to do. You can put a little dot on it, but to be honest the eyes on this model are so small it's going to be fiddly enough to do those 3 bits. So I'm going to go and do all of that, and then come back and show you how I'm going to finish off the armour. Okay, so now you can see with this technique applied to the gemstone in the eye lenses that they're looking a lot more reflective, like they could actually be made of glass or something similar, rather than just you know, a flat layer of paint over a plastic model. So now I just need to finish up the armour, and for the helmet and the shoulder pads, which you can see are just plain green here, I'm going to give them a shade to darken it all down, and that's going to be using Biel Tan green. So whereas on other parts of my Biel Tan army I tend to apply this very sparingly, on these bits, because they're so small, I'm just going to go over the whole thing in this. This will also help to cover up any imperfections in the green. Don't worry if it looks a bit too dark. We're going to go back over this with a darker colour, a lighter colour in a bit, but do be careful to try and not get it on any of the white parts. You can come back and neaten them up later, but it's easier if you don't have to, because this is a very dark green tone and it will really show on any of the white patches. So now with the shadows on the green parts of the armour showing up, we can start to build up a highlight on that. And so I'm going to use the original colour that I used to base it in, the Warpstone Glow, for the first stage of that, and I'm basically going to paint this over the majority of the green bits, just leaving the darker shadows in the recesses. And that's going to be sort of the main colour for this, and then I'm going to do a double edge highlight to really bring out the sharpness of the edges. But first I'll get the Warpstone Glow applied. So the next thing to do on this Jetbike rider is to do the edge highlighting on the green. Now the way I'm going to do this is with sort of a two-layered edge highlight. So I'm going to start with Warboss green and paint that around all of the edges and raised surfaces, including sort of like the sides of the armour plates and also the top of the helmet where it comes to a point there. I'm going to sort of feather around the top of that, so like the top maybe half centimetre or so is green, but it's going to be a little bit also this lighter green. It's going to be feathered rather than sort of a solid colour, and that will make more sense when I actually paint that. Then I'm going to go around that in an even thinner edge highlight of this colour, Skarsnik green. So the first edge highlight is going to be, still thin, but not sort of microscopically thin. And then the next bit, the Skarsnik green, is going to be just the thinnest possible layer, just to give a really sharp edge on that. Now, this is a slightly time-consuming way to do it, but for an army like Eldar, where they're more about quality over quantity, to give them a really nice finish, this looks really good. So I'm going to do the first layer in the Warboss green, show you that, and then do the final layer in the Skarsnik green. Okay, so here you can see the first layer, the Warboss green, applied as a highlight, and you can see the feathering technique at the top of the helmet that I was talking about. So then we're going to do the final highlight on the green parts of the armour in Skarsnik green, and this is going to be a very fine highlight, just picking out the sharpest details and also doing a little bit more feathering on just the top millimetre or two of the helmet. Okay, as you can see, that double-edged highlight has given a really sharp edge to the green armour panels of this model. Now the final stage is just going to be to paint the rest of the armour, do the edge highlight for that. But before I do that, there's just a couple of little bits on the model I want to neaten up with the Ulthuan Grey, the colour that most of this armour is, and then I'll just apply an edge highlight to all the edges of the armour panels, and that's going to be using White Scar, the sort of the purest white colour that Games Workshop produce. And that will then finish up the rider for this Jetbike. And there we go, that's the rider for the Jetbike complete. So we're going to put him aside for a moment and start working on the actual Jetbike. Now, as you can see, I've already base coated this. This is using the Army Painter's Greenskin spray paint primer, which for a model that's going to be mostly this sort of shade of green is just a much more efficient way of doing it. You could it doesn't produce quite the same green as Warpstone Glow, which is what I'm going to be painting this with, but it's close enough that it just makes it a lot easier to paint it rather than using conventional white or black spray primer. So first thing I need to do is just to bring the tone of this completely in line with the colours I'm going to be using. So I'm just going to paint over pretty much the whole model, certainly all the parts that are going to be green, in the Warpstone Glow, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do next. So now that the Jetbike is nicely primed in Warpstone Glow, it's time to pick out some of the non-green details on it. And the first thing I want to do is the metallic parts, because these are the messiest, so getting them done first will allow me to neaten them up as I go, if I sort of go over the lines and paint other parts of the model with the metallics. So two areas I'm going to focus on here, the engine vent and also the engine inlet, which is under here. For these parts I'm going to go for a base coat of lead belcher, then wash them once that's dry with Nuln oil, and then when that's completely dry highlight them with a dry brush of Necron compound, and this is the same technique that I've used for a lot of metallic components through quite a wide variety of armies, but with these being Eldar and them having a little bit of a lighter appearance, I'm not going to apply the ink wash as heavy as I would if it was an Imperial or an Orc vehicle. It's just going to be a very light ink wash, albeit in a very dark colour, so I'll come back once I've done that. Okay, so there you can see that the engine vent has been painted, shaded and then dry brushed, so it's got this nice shiny metallic glow to it now, and stands out from the rest of the model. Next thing to do is going to be to paint the saddle of the jet bike, and first thing I'm going to do for that is just paint the whole saddle area in Dawnstone, this sort of medium grey tone. So going to come back and then we're going to give it a wash. Okay, so the saddle is now base painted, and as you can see I've also painted the handlebars in the same colour. Now to give it a bit of a shade, I'm going to wash it with the Nuln oil paint again, and this will be mainly to sort of darken down the cracks between the panels of the leather, but just helps to tidy it up and add a little bit of a shading around the edge as well. So yeah, I'm going to do that and come back and show you the next step. When you're applying this wash, you don't have to be overly worried about being too neat at this stage, because we're going to come back and neaten it all up later, so if it gets a bit over the green, it doesn't really matter too much. But now, as you can see, the wash has gone into all the recesses and darkened them down while leaving the top parts nice and exposed. Then going to start to build up a highlight on the raised areas, and for this we're going to go back to our original colour, which was Dawnstone, and just going to paint that on all the raised parts of the seats, leaving the deeper parts in shadow. So now all that's left to do to finish off the seat and the handlebars is to give it an edge highlight, and for that I'm going to use Administratum Grey, which is a lighter grey than the Dawnstone we already used for the main colour. And for this edge highlight you just want to pick out the edges of the handlebars and the sort of all around the edges of all the seat panels, and yeah, that shouldn't take too long to do, and I'll be back once that's done. And here you can see that the seat and the handlebars are now completely finished and they look quite nice, so it's time to move on to the next part. Next thing I want to do, because I'm leaving the green till last, is to paint the underside here, and for an example of what I want to do with that, I'm just going to bring in one of my other models, and as you can see it's basically white, but as I've always said, there's very rarely do you paint true white onto a model, so instead I'm going to start by base coating it in a grey colour, and the colour for this is actually going to be Administratum Grey, which is the same colour as I used to highlight the seat. It's actually going to be the base coat on this part. So I'm going to paint that all over the underside here, just leaving this very outer rim in green, and also can't see it very clearly on here, so I'll bring this guy back in. Also the insides of the like under the handlebars, that's going to be grey as well, so paint that in Administratum Grey right now. So yeah, that's just going to be the whole area. Now it will almost certainly take 2 thin coats to do this rather than 1 thick one, but that's always the way to go when you're trying to paint a lighter colour onto a darker colour. Thin coats rather than thick coats. So now that this is base coated with Administratum Grey, I'm now going to layer it with Ulthuan Grey, and this is going to be the main colour for this, so I'm painting it over the majority of the area, just leaving the deepest recesses in the original colour. So as you'd expect, that took 2 thin layers again rather than 1 thick layer to get a nice coverage on that, and you can see here the difference between the darker recesses still in the Administratum Grey and the Ulthuan Grey on the raised areas. Now just to finish off this section of the model, the white underside, I'm going to give it an edge highlight in white scar along the fine point of all the raised edges. And there you can see the highlight of white is now complete, which has given this part of the model a nice three-dimensional look, and also helps it to look like it's completely white, even though it's really just light shades of grey. So with that part of the model finished, the last main area to work on is going to be the main body of the jet bike, all the green parts. Now for these, the first thing I've done is just go back and tidy it all up with Warpstone Glow, because there were splashes of grey and silver from when I was working on the other parts. And then I'm going to use Biel Tan green to shade all the areas down. Now this is the perfect colour for painting Biel Tan Eldar, but what I'm going to do with this, rather than a traditional shade ink wash where you just paint the whole area over the whole part of the model with the shade, in this I'm only going to paint it into the recesses where I actually want the shade to go. So it's going to be places like this shadow part here, around here, and also into these little like indentations in the armour plating, and also things like here on the tail fin and this crack here. And the reason I'm doing this is because it's only very small areas of the model with very defined shading, so you don't need to get the sort of the graduated effect you would have from shading over the whole area. And that's also going to mean it's going to be less time spent layering up to get back to the original colour. So I'm going to go ahead and paint all those shade parts and come back and show you what I did. Okay, and here you can see that the Biel Tan green has gone nicely into the shadowed recessed areas of the model and helped to add to the three-dimensional look of it. You can see it really clearly here on the front of the carapace, but also it's on the back here in all the deeper parts of the model, and just helps to enhance the 3D look of it. Now to finish this model off, I want to give it 2 layered highlights, and this is going to be another double edge highlight like I did on the rider. So first colour for this is going to be the same as we used before, Warboss green, and so I'm going to do a fairly heavy edge highlight in this, but as well as doing the edges, I'm also wanting to pick out some of the raised surfaces that aren't really an edge but would have a highlight on them as well. So like here on top of this panel and along the sort of the sharper sides of this here, as well as the more conventional edges like along the top here and around these deeper recesses. So I'm going to do that in Warboss green before moving on to the final highlight in Skarsnik green. Okay, so that's our first highlight in Warboss green, and now to finish off the double edge highlighting process, we're going to use Skarsnik green, this colour here, which is a paler version of Warboss green, and so we're going to paint a very thin line of this around all the places we've highlighted already, leaving some of the earlier highlights showing, and this is going to be just on the absolute extremity of the edges, like along here. And yeah, that should make the model really pop, while still having a little bit of a transition there between the Warpstone Glow to the Skarsnik green, with the Warboss green acting as an intermediate colour. Okay, so with that highlight done, you can see now that the edges of this model really pop and it looks really nice, and with that done we're practically finished. There's just a few little bits to do. The main thing I want to finish off now is the screen on the on like the handlebars there, just under there. And so the first thing I'm going to do with that is base coat that in Necron Abyss. Now this is one of the old GW Foundation paints. They're sort of the old equivalent of the base paints. I can't remember what the current equivalent of that is, but it's basically just the darkest shade of blue. So I'm going to base coat all the little data screens in that first. So the next thing to do is to paint all the top surfaces in a lighter colour, just leaving the sides in that darker blue. And for this I'm going to use one of my very old GW paints, Enchanted Blue, As you can see, this is a really old pot, but it's still good paint. There is a modern equivalent of this, but as I've still got this, I'm using what I've got. And so yeah, just going to paint that across all the top of the flat surfaces, yeah, just leave the darker bits on the sides. Next thing I'm going to do is to paint the top of all the screens in a lighter shade of blue, leaving the darker colour just around the sides of them. And for this I'm going to use Enchanted Blue, which is one of the old Games Workshop colours. It does have a perfectly good modern equivalent, it's just I've still got this old pot, so I'm going to use that up first before I go out and buy more paint. This is sort of a nice bright medium blue, and so that's going to go on the top of all the screens. Then I'm going to highlight the screen, and to do this I'm going to use Baharoth Blue, which is a really light blue edge paint, and I'm just going to paint that in the bottom left hand corner of each screen, so going up the side and along the bottom a bit, but focusing on the bottom left hand corner. An interesting thing here is that you might be able to see the light from my painting lamp is actually catching those exact points that I want to highlight, so it's actually showing me where to do the highlight. Right, so that's the first highlight done, and now to finish it off I'm just going to give it a very fine highlight, again in the bottom left hand corner, but much smaller this time, and for that I'm going to use White Scar, which is just a pure white layer paint. So I'm going to paint that on there, and then we'll be almost done. So with that highlight applied, the screens are finished, and now the model is basically done. The only thing left to do is to glue on the rider and attach the weapon, so I'm going to do that now and then come back and show you what the finished model looks like. And there we have it, one complete Eldar Windrider Jetbike ready to join my warhost. You will notice that I've also added the weapon at this stage. I painted that in exactly the same way that I painted the other parts of the model, with the silver, the green and the white being done with the same technique, so I didn't feel it necessary to show that on camera because it's just the same as the other parts. The other thing you'll see here is I haven't done the thorn pattern or the transfer yet. Now I am going to do these like I've done on this guy here, but I want to put those out as a separate video because I think there are going to be some people who just want to see that particular pattern. So this video is going to be the basic paint scheme of the jet bike, and then the thorn pattern is going to be another video, and I will put a link to that in the description once it's up, and vice versa. I'll put a link in that one to this video. And although the scheme I've done here is obviously the green and white of Biel Tan, you could in theory adapt this to any other sort of Eldar army. So say for example a same Han army, you'd just switch out the colours with perhaps a base of Mephiston red and highlighting up through Wazdaka red and maybe an orange tone possibly, and then using what's that red wash called, Sharaborg Crimson as the shade, and that would work great on that as well. So you're not limited necessarily by the colours. There's such a good range out there from GW now that you can just switch the colours out to the ones that you want for your Eldar army. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for more painting tutorials, and particularly a look at how I've done the thorn work on this guy. Thanks a lot, bye.